Empty her bag on this table. That is the last instruction Adaeze Chukwuma will ever take from a thief wearing a manager's badge. 41 staff of Adeyemi Trading Group watched in silence as a security officer turned Adeeze's handbag upside down on the conference table. Her cracked phone fell out first, then her house keys, then a small brown bottle of blood pressure tablets for her mother, then a nearly empty purse that scattered across the polished wood like an accusation of its own. On the projector screen behind her, one number glowed in red. 310,000 naira. Yesterday she was begging the union for a salary advance, the operations director, Chief Yemi Balogun, said, pointing at the figure like a man who had personally caught a thief inside a bank vault. Today a vendor pays her more than 4 months of her own wages. Some people carry poverty like a costume, and corruption like a second skin underneath it. Laughter rippled through the back rows. Adeeze's chin trembled, but she did not lower her head. I reported that transfer the moment it entered my account, she said. Check the email. There is no email, the Human Resources Director, Mrs. Patience Okwosa, snapped, slapping her palm flat against the table. Stop performing innocence for an audience. You sold company information, collected your reward, and now you want us to believe you are a village saint. She turned to the security officer. Take her out. The guard's hand closed around Adeeze's arm. That was the exact moment the conference room doors opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in a charcoal agbada walked in, flanked by 3 members of the board. Adeeze stopped breathing. On his feet were a pair of plain black rubber sandals, patched twice at the strap, the same worn sandals she had watched him limp away in 5 days earlier during the worst storm Lagos had seen in 3 years. Lock every door, the man said quietly. Nobody leaves this room until I understand why my own company is destroying an employee, before it has proven a single thing against her. And what the board was about to discover, once those doors were sealed, would expose far more than one false accusation. My people, before we continue, drop your city in the comments and tell me if you have ever watched a good person get punished for someone else's crime. This story is going to hurt before it heals, so stay close, and if you believe kindness deserves to be defended, hit that subscribe button before we begin. 5 days before that conference room exploded into chaos, Adaeze Chukwuma had been counting rain against her window in the small flat she shared with her mother in Ajegunle, watching the storm build over Lagos with the particular dread of someone who knew exactly how much a single bad evening could cost a family with nothing set aside. She was 26 years old, a contract inventory clerk at Adeyemi Trading Group's Apapa distribution office, earning a salary that arrived 2 weeks late more often than it arrived on time, supporting her widowed mother Mama Ngozi, whose hypertension medication consumed nearly a fifth of Adeeze's modest income every single month. She had grown up watching her mother sell second-hand clothes at Idamoto Market after Adeeze's father died in a road accident when she was 9, watching her mother's hands crack from years of counting other people's money and never quite enough of her own, and she had promised herself, somewhere in that long, difficult childhood, that she would build a life sturdy enough to protect them both. That particular Thursday evening, the storm arrived without warning, the kind of sudden, violent downpour that turned Lagos streets into brown rivers within minutes, stranding market women beneath collapsing canopies and sending Okada riders skidding for shelter under bridges. Adeeze had left the office late, delayed by a stock reconciliation report her supervisor had demanded before closing, and found herself walking the last kilometer home through ankle-deep water because the last affordable bus had already been swallowed by traffic. It was on that walk, passing beneath the Mile 2 overpass where roadside vendors packed their wares against the rain, that she saw the old man. He was tall despite his obvious age, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a simple wet kaftan that clung to his thin frame, selling roasted groundnuts from a small wooden tray balanced on an upturned crate. As the wind picked up, a metal signpost torn loose from a nearby shop crashed down across the narrow walkway, and the old man, moving to shield his tray of goods rather than himself, took the full weight of it across his lower leg. He went down hard against the wet concrete, his cry swallowed by thunder, and for several long seconds nobody around him moved. People hurried past with their umbrellas angled against the rain, the particular indifference of a city too exhausted by its own daily survival to stop for a stranger's crisis. Adeeze did not hurry past. She dropped to her knees beside him in the flooding water, her work skirt soaking through instantly, and pressed her cardigan against the gash opening across his shin where the metal edge had cut deep. "Sir, can you hear me? Do not try to stand yet." The old man's breathing was ragged, pain etched sharply across his weathered face, but his eyes, when they found hers, carried a startling clarity despite the shock. "My tray," he managed. "The groundnuts will spoil in this rain." "Forget the groundnuts," Adaeze said, already pulling her scarf free to bind more tightly around the wound. "I need to get you somewhere dry." She flagged down 3 Okada riders before one agreed to help, and together they half-carried the old man to a small provision shop whose owner, recognizing the emergency, cleared space beneath the overhang despite the lost business it would cost her. Adaeze spent the next 40 minutes tending the wound with what first aid supplies the shop owner could provide, using nearly the entire 2,000 naira she had left in her purse to buy antiseptic, bandages, and a bottle of clean water from a nearby pharmacy that had stayed open through the storm. "You should not be spending your money on a stranger," the old man said, watching her work with careful, methodical attention despite her own visible exhaustion. "You should not be lying in flood water with an open wound, sir, but here we are." She tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. "Is there someone I can call? Family? A driver?" "My phone is in my other bag, at the market stall I was covering for my nephew today. It will be soaked through by now, useless." He studied her for a long moment. "Why are you helping me like this? You do not know my name. A wound does not ask permission before it bleeds, sir. I could not leave you there." When the rain finally eased past 9 that evening, Adaeze arranged transport for him to the nearest clinic she trusted, a modest facility in Amukoko where a nurse she'd known since secondary school worked night shifts, paying the consultation fee herself when the old man's pockets, soaked and empty of anything but a few crumpled naira notes from his groundnut sales, could not cover it. "I will repay you," he said as she prepared to leave him in the nurse's care. "I do not forget kindness, especially not kindness that costs the giver something real." "There is no need, sir. Please just take care of that leg." She hesitated at the door. "What is your name? So I know who to ask about, if I ever wonder how you're healing." "Emmanuel," the old man said. "Emmanuel Adeyemi." Adaeze did not think much of the name that night, too exhausted by the long walk home in wet clothes, too worried about explaining to her mother why her purse held almost nothing and her only good cardigan was ruined, to connect it to anything beyond a kind stranger she had helped through a difficult evening. What she did not know, walking home through streets still glistening with the storm's aftermath, was that Emmanuel Adeyemi was the founder and majority shareholder of Adeyemi Trading Group, the very company that employed her, a man who had built the business from a single trading kiosk 40 years earlier and had, in recent years, taken to occasionally working incognito among ordinary Lagosians, precisely because he had grown deeply suspicious that the professional, polished version of his company his executives presented to him bore little resemblance to how it actually treated the people at the bottom of its structure. He had stepped away from daily operations 3 years earlier, handing management to a board and a chief executive he had trusted completely, only to grow increasingly troubled by whispered complaints reaching him through old friends and former employees, complaints about unpaid overtime, about contract staff denied basic protections, about a culture where fear traveled downward while accountability never seemed to travel back up. That storm-soaked evening beneath the Mile 2 overpass had not been an accident of fate exactly. Emmanuel had taken to occasionally selling alongside his nephew's roadside stall specifically to observe, unrecognized, how ordinary Lagosians navigated the same streets his company's trucks and warehouses depended on every single day. He had not expected to test anyone's character quite so dramatically. He had certainly not expected a young woman with almost nothing in her purse to spend the better part of it on a stranger's wound without a single moment's hesitation about what it might cost her. 2 days after the storm, while Adaeze nursed a stubborn cold from her soaked walk home and quietly rebuilt her depleted savings envelope through careful rationing, trouble had already begun brewing at the Apapa distribution office in ways she knew nothing about. Chief Yemi Balogun, the operations director, had spent the previous 18 months quietly diverting inventory through a network of falsified stock write-offs, working alongside Mrs. Patience Okwosa in Human Resources, who controlled the vendor payment approval process for the office's minor procurement needs. Together, they had built a modest but steady scheme, marking damaged or expired goods for disposal that were, in reality, sold through a secondary vendor account controlled by Chief Balogun's brother-in-law, pocketing the difference between the recorded write-off value and the actual resale price. Adaeze, in her role reconciling inventory records against the warehouse's physical stock counts, had begun noticing discrepancies 3 weeks earlier, small inconsistencies at first, easy to dismiss as clerical error, but growing more pronounced as she cross-referenced write-off dates against actual disposal records that never seemed to match the paperwork filed by Chief Balogun's department. She had sent a careful, professionally worded email to her direct supervisor 2 days before the storm, flagging the discrepancy and requesting clarification on the disposal process for a batch of supposedly damaged electronics that, according to the warehouse's own security logs, had left the facility through the loading dock rather than the designated waste disposal route. The email had gone unanswered for 2 days. Then, the same afternoon, Adaeze returned to work still recovering from her storm-soaked ordeal. An unfamiliar transfer arrived in her personal bank account. 310,000 naira, sent from an entity called Coastal Vendor Solutions, with a payment reference reading simply, consulting fee. Adaeze had never heard of Coastal Vendor Solutions. She stared at the notification for a long, disbelieving moment before her training, honed through years of careful, disciplined money management in a household where every naira had to be accounted for, kicked in with sharp, immediate clarity. This was not a gift. This was a trap being built around her, and she needed to move faster than whoever had built it. She screenshotted the transaction within minutes, forwarded it to her personal email as a backup, and sent a formal notification to her company's compliance mailbox and her own bank's fraud department within the hour, documenting the unauthorized transfer and requesting it be immediately frozen or reversed. She copied her closest colleague, Blessing Edom, a payroll assistant she trusted, asking her to retain a copy in case anything happened to Adaeze's own company email access. What Adaeze did not yet understand was that the timing of that transfer was not coincidental. Chief Balogun, alerted by her unanswered discrepancy email that his scheme's paper trail had attracted exactly the kind of careful attention he could not afford, had made a calculated decision. Rather than risk Adaeze's continued investigation exposing the write-off fraud, he would neutralize her credibility entirely, framing her as the actual culprit before she could gather enough evidence to point the finger at him. The following morning, Adaeze's company email access was disabled before 9 o'clock. By 10, she had been summoned to a conference room where Mrs. Okwosa presented the transfer as damning proof of corruption, and by 10:30, 41 of her colleagues had been gathered under the pretext of an urgent integrity briefing, watching as her handbag was emptied across a table in a deliberate, calculated humiliation designed to ensure that whatever quiet investigation followed, Adaeze's reputation would already be publicly, permanently destroyed before a single fact had been properly verified. "Pick it up," Mrs. Okwosa had said when Adaeze's staff identification card clattered to the floor, refusing to bend down herself, forcing the moment of degradation to stretch on in front of the watching crowd. "That is the last company property your dirty hands will ever touch." It was into that exact scene, 41 witnesses deep into Adaeze's public humiliation, that the conference room doors opened, and Emmanuel Adeyemi walked in wearing his patched black sandals, flanked by board members who had clearly been summoned the moment his convoy arrived unannounced at the Apapa facility that morning. "Lock every door," he said, and the room, which had moments earlier been laughing at Adaeze's expense, fell into a silence so complete that the rain still ticking against the window panes outside seemed suddenly impossibly loud. The chairman of the board, standing beside Emmanuel with visible confusion, cleared his throat. "Sir, this is an internal integrity matter regarding a suspected bribery incident involving a contract staff member." "I am aware of what this looks like," Emmanuel said, his gaze sweeping slowly across the scattered contents of Adaeze's handbag, the blood pressure medication, the cracked phone, the nearly empty purse laid bare like evidence of a crime that had not yet been proven. "I would like to understand why it looks like this before anyone leaves this room." Mrs. Okwosa recovered her composure first, straightening her blazer with the particular defensiveness of someone sensing the ground shifting beneath her. "Sir, we have clear evidence. A transfer of 310,000 naira entered her personal account from a vendor connected to procurement irregularities. She has offered no credible explanation." "I reported that transfer myself," Adaeze said, her voice steadier now, anger beginning to burn through the shock. "Within the hour it arrived. To compliance to my bank's fraud department, and to a colleague as backup because I suspected exactly this kind of accusation was coming. There is no such report in our systems, Chief Balogun interjected quickly. Then perhaps, Emmanuel said, turning his full attention toward the operations director for the first time, someone should explain why her company email access was disabled less than an hour after that report would have been sent, and whether that timing strikes anyone else in this room as unusually convenient. The silence that followed carried a different quality now, the particular tension of a room recalculating everything it had confidently believed only minutes earlier. Emmanuel turned to the chairman. I want every email server log preserved from midnight 2 nights ago. I want access records for every account connected to procurement, human resources administration, and inventory disposal. I want the bank transfer traced to its actual originating entity, not merely the name on the reference line. And I want this suspended immediately, without further public spectacle, until an independent investigation, not an internal one run by the very department under suspicion, has established the facts. Sir, Mrs. Okwuosa began. With respect, this could compromise. What it will compromise, Emmanuel said quietly, is whoever built this trap around an employee who did nothing but ask an inconvenient question about missing inventory. He looked at Adaeze directly for the first time since entering the room, and something in his expression, recognition, gratitude, and a specific, quiet fury on her behalf passed between them without a single word needing to explain it. I know this young woman. I know exactly the kind of character it takes to spend nearly everything in your purse helping a stranger with nothing to offer in return. That is not the profile of someone who sells confidential information for a bribe. That is the profile of someone this company should be protecting, not humiliating. The gathered staff, 41 witnesses who had laughed only minutes earlier, now shifted uncomfortably, the specific discomfort of people realizing they had participated in something considerably uglier than an ordinary disciplinary matter. Emmanuel instructed the chairman to have Adeeze's belongings gathered with care, her identification restored, and her suspension converted immediately to paid administrative leave pending a proper, independent investigation, one that would examine every party connected to the write-off discrepancies she had originally flagged, not merely the accusation constructed against her. As the room began, slowly, to empty, Adeeze remained seated, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, the accumulated adrenaline of the morning finally catching up with her exhausted body. Emmanuel approached, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of a man whose leg wound, though healing, still pained him 5 days after the storm. I told you I do not forget kindness, he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her rather than towering over her the way everyone else in that room had for the past hour. I did not expect to repay it quite so publicly or quite so urgently, but I imagine you would rather I arrived a few minutes earlier than not at all. You are Emmanuel Adeyemi, Adeeze said slowly, the full weight of the name, and everything it meant about the company that employed her, finally settling into place. The founder. The chairman. I am. And you are the young woman who spent nearly 2,000 naira on bandages and antiseptic for a stranger bleeding in a storm, and did not think to ask his name until after she had already finished helping him. He studied her carefully. I need you to understand something important, Adeeze. What is happening to you this morning is not about the money in your account. It is about someone in this building who was frightened enough by your honest questions about missing inventory that they decided destroying your credibility was safer than answering them. The independent investigation that followed, led by an external forensic accounting team Emmanuel personally commissioned within days of that conference room confrontation, moved with a thoroughness the internal system had never once applied to Adeeze's original discrepancy report. Investigators traced the 310,000 naira transfer through Coastal Vendor Solutions banking records to an account ultimately controlled by a relative of Chief Balogun, confirming what Adeeze had already suspected the moment the unexplained money appeared. They discovered that the reference to consulting fee had been deliberately worded to imply improper payment for information, when in fact the transfer had originated from the exact procurement account Chief Balogun's disposal scheme routed its diverted proceeds through, a clumsy, hastily executed attempt to frame Adeeze using money that, if properly traced, would actually condemn its sender. They found that Mrs. Okwuosa's claim of a missing compliance report was false. Adeeze's email, sent at precisely the timestamp she had described, remained recoverable from the server's backup logs, even after being deleted from the visible inbox through an administrator function traced directly to a device assigned to human resources. They uncovered, through 18 months of falsified write-off records cross-referenced against the warehouse's actual physical disposal logs, a pattern of inventory fraud totaling nearly 19 million naira in diverted goods, considerably larger than the isolated incident Adaeze had originally flagged, revealing that her single, careful email about a batch of mismatched electronics had, without her ever intending it, threatened to unravel a scheme that had been quietly bleeding the company for well over a year. The board's formal findings meeting, convened 3 weeks after that storm-soaked evening beneath the Mile 2 overpass, unfolded before the full executive team, 41 staff members who had witnessed the original humiliation, and Adeyemi himself, seated not at the head of the table but among the board, his patched black sandals resting quietly beneath a chair that made no attempt to claim more authority than the evidence itself deserved to carry. Chief Balogun's employment was terminated for gross misconduct, with the matter formally referred to Nigeria's Financial Crimes Authorities for prosecution. Mrs. Okwosa's employment was terminated for retaliation, abuse of disciplinary authority, and falsification of internal records, her own role in disabling Adeeze's email access and orchestrating the public conference room humiliation documented in exhaustive, unforgiving detail across the investigation's final report. Civil recovery proceedings began against both former executives and the shell entities their scheme had relied upon. Adeeze was formally cleared of every allegation, her suspension expunged from her record, and a written correction issued to every single employee who had witnessed her original humiliation, stating plainly that she had reported the unauthorized transfer immediately, and that the accusations against her had been entirely unfounded. "I do not want revenge," Adeeze told the board during her own testimony, her voice steady now in a way it had not been during that first terrible morning. "I want the company to understand that asking an honest question about missing inventory should never cost someone their dignity, their reputation, or their sense of safety at work. I want contract staff, people whose employment status makes them easiest to intimidate into silence, to know they can raise concerns without their handbags being emptied in front of their colleagues as a warning to everyone else." Emmanuel, listening from his seat among the board, made a note that would become, over the following months, the foundation of a company-wide overhaul of Adeyemi Trading Group's internal reporting structure. A third-party whistleblower channel, entirely independent of any department capable of retaliating against the person using it. Mandatory separation between the staff who identified inventory discrepancies, those who approved write-offs, and those who authorized final disposal, ensuring no single individual could quietly control the entire process the way Chief Balogun once had. Formal written protections for contract staff facing disciplinary proceedings, guaranteeing representation and a genuine, documented process before any public disciplinary action could occur. He offered Adeeze a promotion, a formal, permanent position as the company's first internal audit integrity officer, a role she accepted not because Adeyemi had once owed her a debt from a storm-soaked evening, but because an open, competitive interview process concluded she was, by a considerable margin, the most qualified candidate the company had ever considered for exactly that kind of work. "You do not need to feel obligated toward me," she told him carefully, during their first formal meeting after her appointment, wary of a gratitude that might quietly calcify into something less honest than the working relationship she actually wanted. "I did not help you that night because I hoped for anything in return." "I know," Emmanuel said. "That is precisely why I trust your judgment now. A person who helps a stranger while calculating what it might earn them rarely makes a reliable custodian of a company's integrity. A person who helps because the wound in front of her matters, regardless of what it costs her personally, that is exactly the character this company needs watching over its books." Over the following 2 years, Adeeze rebuilt the Apapa distribution office's inventory and procurement processes from the ground up, training a small team specifically drawn from contract and junior staff, the exact population Chief Balogun and Mrs. Okwosa's scheme had counted on remaining too frightened to ask difficult questions. She implemented cross-verification systems that made the kind of quiet, sustained fraud that had bled the company for 18 months considerably harder to hide, and she personally reviewed every whistleblower report that arrived through the new independent channel, insisting on the same careful evidence-first standard that had eventually vindicated her own case. Her mother's blood pressure medication no longer consumed a fifth of her monthly income. The small flat in Ajegunle was replaced 18 months later, Buy a modest but genuinely comfortable 2-bedroom apartment closer to the Apapa office, purchased outright through savings that no longer required the anxious, careful rationing of Adee's earlier years. Emmanuel visited the office periodically, not as the chairman conducting inspections, but as an old man who had, in his own words, finally found proof that the company he'd spent 40 years building still contained the exact kind of character worth protecting. He never wore anything but his patched black sandals to those visits, a quiet, deliberate reminder to everyone who noticed them that the people most easily dismissed by rank or title were often carrying the clearest sight of what actually mattered. "Do you regret it?" he asked her once, nearly 2 years after that storm, watching her review a whistleblower report with the same careful, unhurried attention she'd once given his bleeding leg beneath a stranger's overhang. "Spending nearly everything you had that night, knowing now everything it eventually cost you before it gave anything back?" Adeeze considered the question seriously, the way she considered every important question now, weighing it against everything she had lost and rebuilt in the years since. "I regret that it took a storm and a stranger's injury to finally reveal what was already wrong in this building," she said. "But I do not regret stopping that night. I think if I had walked past you the way everyone else did, I would have become exactly the kind of person this company's culture was quietly training all of us to be. Too frightened of the cost to ever help anyone who could not immediately help us back. If you have ever asked an honest question that made powerful people uncomfortable, or helped a stranger when you genuinely had almost nothing left to give, I hope this story reminds you that character revealed in small, unwitnessed moments has a way of eventually finding the exact audience that needed to see it most. If this story moved you tonight, please like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it, and let me know in the comments, has there ever been a moment when doing the right thing cost you more than you expected, before it finally gave something back? Until next time, my people, be the kind of person who stops in the storm. You never know whose whole life is waiting on the other side of that decision, including sometimes your own. Good night and thank you for watching.